Welcome to another episode of Issues of the Heart podcast. I'm your host, Brother Kobe
Rogers.
We've covered some things related to the government and our role and with it. And so now we want to get into more of the thing of, well, should we involve ourselves in political parties? Should we vote? And so we want to look at some of the things dealing with that. Now, one of the things that's interesting and looking at this is we discussed this before that the Bible doesn't specifically tell us certain things. So you're not going to go and read in the Bible and read something about what car should you drive or things of whether or not you should ought to wear a tie or not and so forth. So there are certain things that's not in there, but we derive, because the Bible tells us don't smoke cigarettes and so forth. But there's principles that we can derive from the Word of God that we can get an understanding. And so God knew through certain principles that if we understood it, it would be a guide to us to making certain choices. So we have a lot to cover. Let's get right into it. So should Christians align themselves with political parties? Let's look at this. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 14 through 18. And we know this one, and normally people use this one when it comes to marriage, but this is a broad principle that can cover many areas. The Bible tells us, beginning in verse 14, it says, "Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with unrighteousness, and what communion has light with darkness? And what concord has Christ with Belial? Or what part has he that believes with an infidel? And what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For you are the temple of the living God, as God has said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore, come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, and will be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty." And so here, we see God telling us, hey, there's certain things we ought to separate from, certain things we should not be aligned with. And we can use this when it comes to political parties, because when you look at it, people who align themselves with these political parties, from what I've seen, and if somebody says, well, I'm a Republican, and they tend to have these blinders on, well, I'm fully on the Republican side. So, any candidate, any endorsement that comes from them, normally they won't speak against it, or they look at the other side as the enemy. And listen, you might have good and bad, right and wrong with both sides, but if you get to the point where everything that's in your party you can't speak out against, or everything they do is right, every candidate is right, and everything coming from over here is wrong, then you create problems. And especially when you wear these political badges and you bring it into the church. What's interesting, you realize that there was a time when early in the church's history, 1800s was what I mean, that people literally was walking around in church with political badges showing their political alliance to certain things. Now what happens is the schism that it can bring, if I'm Republican and you're a Democrat, and I'm over here promoting Republicanism, right? And you look at that like, oh, he gonna promote his side, I'm gonna go ahead and promote my side. And so that can create friction and issues between us, because we're choosing this. And normally what happens then is they begin to then put those political alignings even above their responsibility to God and to his word and to the truth. And Paul had an issue in the church that he needed to address, that I think it's can be principles derived from that would help us in this regard. This is what he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 10 through 13. You had people in the church at the time that was doing this. "Now I beseech you," in verse 10, "Now I beseech you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that ye shall speak the same thing, that there be no divisions among you, and that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. For it has been declared unto me of you, my brethren, by them which are of the house of Cleo, that there are contentions among you. Now this I say, that every one of you says, I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, and I am of Cephas, and I am of Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were ye baptized in the name of Paul? So here we have it in the church at that time, that there was divisions and strifes among the believers, because they said, I'm from this party, I'm from the party of Paul, I'm from the party of Apollos, I'm from the party of Cephas, which is Peter. And so if you had these contentions and these divisions coming because of that, imagine in the political realm, people doing the same thing. Well, I'm of this party, I support this candidate, I'm of that candidate. It creates the same type of schism, the same type of problem. And they're like, well, we are all, Paul, Apollos, Cephas, and so forth, we have the same mind. We're striving towards the same thing. We have the same mission. So there should be you shouldn't be saying, well, I'm of him, and versus being of this one, because we are striving for the same thing. We have the same mission, same goal, same outlook. We're trying to accomplish the same things, but you're trying to cause a division by saying, I'm from this one because so-and-so did Bible studies with me, so-and-so baptized me, and you see that people today, so-and-so brought me into the church, and so I'm with this person, so-and-so baptized me, I learned the truth from them, so there's a certain loyalty to that person. And so, but when you start using that to cause divisions in the church, he said, man, that's a problem. As a matter of fact, he goes on in chapter 3 and says this. He says, chapter 3, verse 3 and 4, he says, for you are yet carnal. For whereas there is among you envyings and strife and divisions, are you not carnal and walk as men? For one says, I am of Paul, and another, I am of Apollos. Are you not carnal? So Paul's saying, if y'all having these divisions because you're choosing sides, you're choosing earthly people, earthly quote-unquote candidates, if you will, it says, you carnal. That's not something that a spiritual person does. Putting these different people against one another. And so if you have people that's there, each person should be striving to live, I'm speaking as far as Americans here in America, these candidates should both be striving to uplift America and allow us to prosper as a nation. So to join one party and to join another and to bring this friction, this strife. And again, we talked about it earlier. I've seen the friction and the strife that's coming because people are joining these different parties. And again, there was a time where I've never seen the church so political. I've never seen the church in a position where they were outwardly, going to rallies, that they were, outwardly supporting candidates and doing different things, and they become echo chambers of the candidate and the party that they're endorsing. And so if somebody's on the other side, or they perceive somebody as on the other side, or somebody says something about their candidate that they don't like, all of a sudden, the claws come out, then that becomes a problem, because now you're creating issues in the church based on the political leanings that you have. And so one of the things, now we're going to get into the whole, well, should we vote for political candidates and so forth, should we vote? But to have these outward leanings for one party versus another, you should be judging based on, hey, who's going to be the best person, and the best person might not always come from a single party. And there was a time where when you would vote, that you can press one button and it will vote down the political party that you for, like Republican, it will vote all Republican or all Democrat if you was for that. And so it was that easy. And think about it. Well, is a Republican candidate always the best candidate for that position? Is a Democratic candidate always the best candidate? But because of your political leanings, you're just going to have this person put in this position. And that removes you from being able to really examine what they stand for, what they promote, and these different things. But again, that aside, when you bring it into the church and you create these divisions, then you stifle what God is trying to do for the church. You stifle the witness that ought to be there. Because if people come in, they see, man, the church is all divided. It's one thing, we see the political landscape in the world and all the fighting and the back, if you're for a certain candidate, that dictates what news source you're going to be looking at. If you're for this candidate, listen, that's the fake news over there. This is the real one right here, and we're going to listen to this one. So it's even divided in that. But if we see the world acting like this, okay, they're in the world. But to see Christians behaving and taking on that same attitude that you see in the world, that's got to be a problem. There's got to be something that needs to be addressed.
So there are going to be more divisions. Unfortunately, they will arise simply because of the times in which we live in. And yet at the same time, while the divisions arise, Christ is still drawing his church, his people together. It's pressed together, and pressed together. So politics, as we look at it, then we talked about earthly governments. And so governments, we've identified that they quote unquote are ordained of God. And so then the next step in that would be then, well, if God ordains quote government, the system of government, then it's going to vary depending on, quote unquote, if it's, a democratic government or if it's a parliamentarian government, etc. So how is it governed? How is it led? Well, then politics are going to play a part of that. But from a scriptural basis, then what you're sharing then is that one shouldn't be blinded to say, well, okay, I'm going to yield my allegiance to this party. And then therefore, by doing so, essentially then whatever that party does, it's going to be ride or die. Whatever they do is, I'm going to explain away their grievances, that they weren't that bad, as just being misunderstood, and that the other, party, quote unquote, is bad. And if I'm on this side, then it's going to be viewed in that same level of contempt and so forth. And those things then brought into the church will generally times foster division. It can foster separation. It can foster alienation, which it shouldn't be. In fact, it's interesting though, because some of the things in terms of, you see, particularly it's a highly charged environment today. But when you look in bygone eras, there have been some different instances where it's been charged, but there have been calls where people say, well, look, let's do the business and let's get together as a people, because the needs of America outweigh our own personal interests. And I think in this particular case, certainly the needs of the church far outweigh, quote unquote, a person's interests. And so we don't want the church to be divided, but we're going to look and find out certainly what is then, because some people say, well, then we shouldn't have any role whatsoever in influence in government. Okay, so I know some groups that say that because Jesus said in John 19 that his kingdom is not of this world. Okay, and so they say, well, look, we're looking for a heavenly kingdom, therefore we have nothing to do with earthly kingdoms whatsoever. So let them figure it out. We're going to go over in this direction as such. But we can see then, because they say, well, there's no, whoever you put in office, if they do, and I've heard this as well, if you put someone in office, you're guilty of whatever their choices are, right? So if they vote X, then that sin comes to you. Well, then I would reason out and say, well, then is that true? If you say, well, hey, let's vote for this person to be a deacon. Let's vote for this person to be an elder. Let's vote for this person to be the treasurer. If they do wrong, then does that mean that you're culpable? You're responsible for that choice? Because it's the same thing, just boiled down on a smaller level, just in the church environment and so forth.
Yeah, what's interesting about that too, God ordained people. God chose people. And they didn't turn out right. Yeah. They wound up doing something. Like we talked about Saul earlier. God chose that man and placed him there, and God gave him everything that he needed to be successful. But ultimately, he wound up making choices that caused God to have to reject him. But the thing is, God placed him there, and so now that God placed him there, is God responsible for all the evil that he did? The different, we ordained ministers, like you said. So when they turn out to do some evil things, are the people that laid hands on them and anointed them, are they responsible for everything he did while he was in that holy office? And so you got to think about that. And so that's a clear point to look to. And so, but the opposite end of that is if you don't lend your voice or your vote, and the wrong person gets in and they does evil, are you responsible for the evil that they do, in the sense that you could have stopped them from being in office, but you allowed it by your compliance in your silence? Are you responsible for that? And so I want to look at this in the sense of, all right, when we're looking at those in leadership position, God actually spoke and said things about people in these roles. We know in the Proverbs, in Proverbs chapter 31, not only Proverbs 31, that's the virtuous woman chapter that people look to. But before we got there, there was counsel given to the king about how he was to execute righteousness, and there was a standard that was there. Notice what this says in Proverbs 31, and starting in verse 4 through verse 9. It says, "It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes strong drink, lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted." Then it says in verse 8, Open your mouth for the dumb and the cause of all such as are appointed to destruction. Open your mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and needy. So here, speaking to the king, God is saying the king shouldn't be an intemperate person. The king shouldn't be an immoral person, because if they don't have self-control, how can you expect them to legislate righteousness? How can you expect them to do what is right as far as law? They're going to pervert judgment. They're going to pervert justice. They're not going to speak out for the poor, the oppressed, and so forth. But if they're sober-minded, if they're men of integrity and principle, you can expect from them that they would do that which is right. And Ecclesiastes, he says, "Blessed art thou, O land, when your princes is the son of nobles, and they eat in due season for strength and not for drunkenness." So he said, you're going to be blessed if the person that is ruling has is a man of temperance, is a person of integrity, if they have self-control. And so also in Isaiah, it speaks to those, that were immoral. And because they were immoral, then it was seen in how they govern. And so I must say a strong statement. Only men of strict temperance and integrity should be admitted into our legislative halls and courts of justice. Intemperate men should not, by the vote of the people, be placed in positions of trust. So the moral standing of a person is important. So you shouldn't look at, and again, we're dealing with our society because we have a vote, we have a voice in what our government does. Other people in other nations, they don't have that ability. But I remember the first time I voted was in 2008. And I was going to vote because of the whole, Prop 8 situation, the gay marriage. And so I was going down there to vote, and I was happy and I was excited. I'm voting this thing against this thing. And so I go down there, and I never voted before. And so I go, and this black lady that's there, and she sees me. I'm asking, like, hey, where do I go? What do I do? And so she sees me. She's all happy and excited with me. She's like, oh, yeah, go over here. Because in her mind, she's thinking, oh, I'm going to vote for Obama. And so consciously, I wasn't going to do that because I'm voting against the gay marriage, but he was a proponent of it. So I can't vote for him and then vote just down at the same time, me conscientiously. But I'm going to say this. I'm not against voting for president, although I have never done it. I don't see that as wrong. I don't see that as something we shouldn't do. So I went to vote for that issue and that issue alone. But the more I begin to understand my responsibility, and that's one of the things that I look at, is that how can a people that follow God, follow the word of God, clearly look at somebody that's a moral degenerate, somebody that doesn't have principles and morals, and you look at that person and you say, yes, that's the man for the job, because the Bible is on us. People like that, they can't be trusted to do what's right in office. You can't trust somebody that doesn't have self-control, somebody that's doesn't stand on principle, that they're going to do that which is right in office. So how can we then conscientiously say, I'm voting for that person? And so I'm looking at a landscape now, and I'm just going to be completely honest. I'm looking at people, and there's this frenzy that I've never saw before. And it's one thing for the world to have it, but in the church to see this frenzy over a man that when you look character-wise, it's like, how can you vouch for that? How could you vote for that? And one of the things that's interesting to me looking at it, and I know why there's a lot of this, enthusiasm for this person, but I'm not going to address that and speak to that. But when I look at the fact that, because I don't have any political alliance, I can look at Obama and be objective and honest, be like, I didn't like when he did that, I don't like that. But he didn't carry himself like a buffoon. He carried himself with integrity as a man of principle. He wasn't walking around just of ill repute. Yet, on the opposite end, we see somebody that, as Christians, you're endorsing a person, and I would ask people, I would say, hey, did you see what he said and what he did? And because of their political leanings, they couldn't even acknowledge and address and say, yeah, that was clearly wrong. Clearly that was immoral. Clearly that wasn't right. Christians, mind you, that can't acknowledge a wrong in a person. They can't acknowledge when somebody, because of political leanings, now you're tainting the word of God. Now remember, just looking at, what's going on, what just happened with the whole storming of the Capitol and so forth. And, these protesters were out there, and clearly, they were told to go down there and protest. They were not told to riot, but they were told to go down there and protest. And they went, listening to their leader. But then when they begin to storm and riot and do all of these things, you listen to his supporters in the church, and all of a sudden, oh no, those are not really his supporters, those are paid actors. Yet a couple of months before, when you had the BLM people protesting, all of a sudden, oh no, those are the real people. They didn't say those were paid actors. They didn't say none of that. And even though it was people from different ethnicities, white, black, Hispanic, Asian folk, Hindu, Arabian, everybody was looting and doing different things, but they didn't say those were paid actors. Those were BLM. But when it comes to this situation, now it's all of a sudden, oh, those are paid actors. Those weren't really his supporters. And I'm like, I can't trust your judgment, because it's obviously skewed based on your political leanings. And that's the trouble I see in the church. And so to me, you're putting that political badge above the kingdom of heaven. You're putting that first. And so now you got to come up with all these conspiracy theories to not acknowledge when wrong is clearly done. And so I'm looking at this and I'm like, this is horrible. This is terrible. As we as a people, that we get caught up in this, that now you can't even walk in righteousness. You can't be truthful. You can't be honest based on where you have leaned politically. And again, I'm not against voting. I'm not against people voting for people. I'm going to address that a little bit later, but it's just sad from what I'm seeing with people.
Well, to go back for a minute, the two-party system, or two major party system in America, it has impacted the church. Really, the quote, the white church and conservatives have looked more at with favor with the Republicans because of the issue of abortion, abortion rights, and so forth. And so, because of quote the sanctity of life, they then have more aligned themselves with Republicans, because generally speaking, Republicans have said we are pro-life. Democrats have said that we are pro-choice. A woman has the choice in terms of what takes place with their body and so forth. And so in the Republicans you can go a Republican party, then you can go a little further to say, well, there's pro-life under any and all circumstances. So, the mother can be about to die. It could be a case of incest. It could be a case of rape. Really doesn't matter, because of that, once the child was conceived, and then you start getting to the argument or debate as to, well, when is life? Was it conceived when the union of a sperm and an egg takes place, or is it at 3 months, or is it 6 months, or at what point, and so forth. And so then that's where you some of the verbiage that comes out in terms of, well, it's a fetus, it's a baby, etc., etc. And again, probably not the time to go into all that. But just in a nutshell, though, that forms the basis, though. So because Christians look and say, well, hey, the Bible says thou shalt not kill. Then if this group is saying we're going to quote ban the killing then of the unborn, then this is the party we need to be with. And so then therefore, I can't choose quote unquote the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party, Democrats, because they will allow for pro-choice. So this is upholding the commandments. This is quote violating commandments. And then of course you can talk about marriage and homosexual rights or gay rights. You can, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Therefore, then people make a choice to say, well, I will align. And therefore, then as a result, if a leader then is quote immoral, then that may not be my preference. However, I still must go along with it because of the platform. So I'm voting for the platform as to which they stand. So it's not really about the person, but it's about the platform. And therefore, it doesn't matter what the person does, because I'm not going to look at him as an individual or her as an individual. I'm looking at the platform. Do they have the endorsement? Will they support those main tenets? Therefore, everything else is excusable or inexcusable, etc. So that's creates the issue. When we talk about now the current situation, different conspiracies, of course, would suggest that Democrats are pedophiles. They're Satan worshipers. And so President Trump, in this particular case, then he is sent to bust up a ring of pedophiles and to bring back order and so forth. And so people use Bible text to be able to support their point of view, because they say, well, even though he may be, quote, doing wrong or immoral, then, and I don't want it to relegate to him. So anyone in that particular case, they're doing wrong or they're immoral, God is using them, just as he used Cyrus, just as he used Nebuchadnezzar. These are, quote, heathens that were used to do and to perform his will. So that's kind of the playing the devil's advocate, the side that comes to suggest that. And then therefore, again, anything that takes place, is okay. And in this particular instance, why wouldn't it be wrong to quote unquote to overturn a quote illegal election, because this is the man that God would want to have in office, but essentially Satan is working to be able to keep him back. So we need to be on the side of just. So therefore, these actions would be excusable, because we just can't sit back and allow the nation to go to hell in a handbasket.
Yeah, it's very interesting how stirred up, because even me, we had this conversation before, how I was having a conversation with somebody, and and I never just jump into these conversations because I don't really care like that. But then it was brought to my attention, like, President Trump had the biggest inauguration turnout ever, and I'm looking like, because I'm knowing it ain't true, and I'm like, no, that didn't happen like that. And so then he's like, yeah, and I'm like, well, that's fake news. Then you go into all the conspiracy theories. And so I'm just like, okay, whatever. So I come to church. A couple of days later, same person is up speaking, and they start off, they throw on the screen some dude in his mama's basement going on about how Trump had the biggest inauguration in history. I'm like, what this got to do with Jesus and with the gospel? I got up and I walked out. And I remember my wife was standing out there. I told her, I'm never sitting and listening to that person again, because at this point, I can't trust your judgment. And so, I'm very picky about who I listen to. So, but see, that right there, that's why you leave that political stuff out the church. But see, that's what I'm saying. I've never seen that before from church members. They normally left it out, but all of a sudden now they bring it in. Like, who are you advocating for? You advocating for Jesus, or you advocating for a president? And the thing is, we can play the pros and cons game with Democrats, because both of them have good and bad in both. And so, yeah, you can have the good over here, you can see the ill over here, and which is clear. And I remember just in this case, I'm going back this far, but I'm just to bring it to our minds that when Lincoln was running, he was running against Johnson, and Lincoln took more of a neutral role, but he was known still as a man of integrity, an honest man. Yet Johnson, he was pro-slavery, and so imagine you a slave at the time, you can't vote, but you're a believer, and your brethren over here, he can vote, right? And so he chooses to, like, I'm not voting. And so the pro-slavery person gets in. So how would you look at your brother that had the right to vote, that could have voted this man, but because of his non-vote, he allowed the candidate to come in that was pro-slavery, that's going to keep you in that condition. So you can't sit here and tell me, now again, you can have your pros and cons, but the clear and obvious choice should be that you had the fugitive slave law. Now, again, I don't know if they could have voted on that, whether they just passed it, but as a Christian, you couldn't follow that. But this is the thing: if you have the right person in office that they can vote it in or vote it down, then you should have a moral obligation. I'm going to read something from scriptures too, because it's important. And you mentioned this earlier. I'm gonna have to be quick with this for time's sake. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1 and 2, and you read this. And this is why it's so important for us to understand, like, hey, you can vote for a candidate, and you ought to vote for issues too. But it says this: I exhort you, therefore, that first of all, supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings, and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. And so he said we ought to be praying for those in authority, because that affects our personal peace. Yeah. Who's in office and what they're going to choose to do can affect our personal peace. And he says this in Jeremiah 29:7. And seek the peace of the city, whether I have caused you to be carried away captive, and pray unto the Lord for it. For in the peace thereof, you shall have peace. In the peace thereof, you shall have peace. So, and we think about just praying. We talked about this before, and we need to understand that a lot of times prayers demand our action. And so there was a case where the children of Israel had just left Egypt, and they get attacked by the Amalekites. And so they have to go out to battle. And so while they're there, Moses has his hands raised, right? But after a while, his hands got heavy. Your hands will get tired. And as it went down, the Amalekites began to win. But if his hands were up, then Israel will be winning. And so it's interesting to me that God had just plagued all of Egypt, opened the Red Sea, was doing all these miracles left and right. You mean to tell me he couldn't do a miracle to keep Moses' hands raised?
Yeah.
Yet he had these two men, one on each side, sit Moses down and hold his hands up. And now while his hands were held up, they're victorious. If his hands go down, then they're defeated. And the thing that we can learn from this is that those who are in leadership positions, if there's a low grade of morality there, then as a people, we become defeated. If the morality is high, if we keep the hands raised through prayer and our actions, then as believers, we can be victorious. And so depending on the hands being lifted up or falling, and that's why we ought to be there to lift up, not just through prayer, but through action, the leaders, so that we can live a quiet and peaceful life. Otherwise, think about it, if people are legislating immorality, then that will negatively affect us. Do you have anything to add before we?
No.
Okay. I think we're really past our time, and so hopefully we understand that voting for people, the right person, whether it be Republican or Democrat, but not to align ourselves with different parties, but you can look to and say, all right, this person is the best candidate. And really the issues, and we haven't really talked about that, but the issues that are at stake, we can really lend our voices and our votes to these things. But let us be mindful to whoever's in office to keep them uplifted in prayer, and by our actions, by our vote, doing what we can to secure the peace of the land. And until next time, remember the proverb, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life.